Hi, my name is Brenton Harrison, and we're here to kick off a series on a type of compensation called equity compensation. And in part one, we're covering a very common benefit found amongst executives and new hires at large corporations called restricted stock units. Let's get started. As you progress in your career, one of the first things that changes is the way that you're compensated. And you go from prior to that point, simply being incentivized and rewarded for good work by having a 5% or a 10% pay increase to now being offered not only the pay increase, but also something called equity compensation. And there are many different forms of equity compensation that companies will either use to incentivize new hires or to reward people when they're doing their annual reviews. So this is very common, and it's something that we wanted to cover for those who might be in a situation where they're getting offered this type of benefit, but they don't really know how it works. So to that end, we're kicking off a series on these forms of equity compensation, just in case you're in the situation where you're now being offered these types of benefits and are trying to find some resources to help sort through what the offer is, whether it's a strong offer, and whether it's the right offer for you. Now, as I said in part one, we're kicking things off with a video on restricted stock units. But before we get into the specifics of restricted stock units, I want to make sure we break down the two different types of equity-based pay. And this is my terminology. This is not something you're going to read online. But in my opinion, when you're discussing equity-based pay, there's really two types. There's types of equity-based pay that I would call could be yours. And there's types of equity-based compensation that is a will be yours benefit. A could be yours benefit is equity-based pay that you could have access to if you decide to make the purchase of those benefits. But if you decide against it, it's not yours. It simply could be yours. Will be yours benefits are benefits that are yours. You don't have to make a decision. They already are going to be given to you whether you want to accept them or not. And now it just becomes a decision of how you're going to use those benefits at your disposal. Restricted stock units are a form of will be yours benefits. It is something that you will enjoy, provided that you stay at your employer long enough to vest in the stock units that are granted to you. And we're going to explain what all of those terms mean in this video. Restricted stock units can be distributed or granted to you at different points in your employment. As I said, it could be when you're deciding to take a job. It could be when you're being promoted, or it could just be a part of your annual compensation package that you might evaluate with your superiors on a regular basis. As an example, you might be granted 1,000 shares of company stock upon your hiring, but just because you've been granted these shares doesn't mean they're yours to do with what you please. In order for you to have full control and ownership of the shares, they must also be what's called vested. Vested means that you do have full ownership of those shares, and when you're granted restricted stock units, or RSUs for short, they are accompanied by a vesting schedule. And that vesting schedule not only tells you the length of time that you have to stay at that company for all of the shares to vest, but it also tells you the frequency with which they will be vested. Investing schedules make perfect sense when you think about it. If I'm giving you 1,000 shares of company stock and they are yours immediately, I grant them to you and you're immediately vested, well, now there's no incentive for you to actually stay and work for me at that company. And that's the whole reason I gave you the shares in the first place. So by accompanying a vesting schedule, what you're doing is you're spreading it out over 3 or 4 years, even longer in some cases, to make sure that that person you hired and gave that incentive will stay with you long enough for them to get the benefit of the shares, but for you to get the benefit of their employment as the employer. And if an employee doesn't meet the terms of that vesting schedule and they leave, any remaining unvested shares simply go away. They don't get the benefit of having them. So it's a strong tie, a golden handcuff to make sure that this strong benefit puts someone in a position where they have to actually turn down a benefit if they decide to not meet the obligations of their offering. In these videos, in this series on equity-based compensation, you're going to hear me talking a lot about taxes because it's really important to understand how they work with these different offerings. And for will be yours benefits like restricted stock units, initial taxation occurs at the point in time when those shares are vested. When you can say that these shares are yours and under your control, that is when taxation occurs. Why is this the case? Why don't they tax you when those shares are granted in the first place? Because if they've granted granted but not vested, then it's something that you'll have at some point in time, but you can't control it. It's simply something that's just kind of sitting out there on a ledge, waiting for you to get tall enough where you can grab it off of that shelf. So they don't tax you at that point in time because there's been no true benefit. It's something that you will have, but you don't have it now. When you vest, however, and now you can do with those shares what you please, initial taxation occurs because you have been paid. It's a form of pay. It's not cash, but it is compensation in the form of equity. And when you are compensated, you have to pay the tax man as well. Let's look at an example of an employee granted 2,000 shares of common stock in their company with a current value of $100 per share, vested quarterly over a 4-year time period. You can see that these 2,000 shares of common stock were granted on January 1st, 2022, and the current share price at the time of grant was $100 per share. So you can see the total value of this offering is $200,000 of current value. And these vest over a quarterly period over 4 years, which means that each quarter, 125 shares are going to vest. And 125 shares, based on the current share price, is $12,500 of value. Since $12,500 worth of shares vested in this quarter, our employee has earned that amount for tax purposes. So when they file their taxes, it will essentially be part of their salary, even though they can't spend it like cash while it's in the form of stock. Now, at some point, for reasons we're going to cover in a second, a person with RSUs may want to be able to sell their shares, which is where the second tax question comes into play. Is the sale of a stock a long-term or a short-term capital gain? A short-term capital gain occurs when you sell an investment or a piece of property for a profit when you've held it for less than a year. And the reason you want to avoid short-term capital gains as much as possible is because short-term capital gains are taxed at what's called ordinary income rates, which simply means that if you have a short-term capital gain, it will be taxable to you as if it were a pure part of your salary. There is no differentiation. The ideal way to sell an RSU is not for a short-term capital gain, but to do so when it's considered a long-term capital gain. A long-term capital gain occurs when you sell an investment or a piece of property for a profit, and you've held that investment or property for longer than a year. That's a long-term capital gain. Short-term capital gain is held less than a year. Long-term capital gain is held for at least a year. And the tax rate for long-term capital gains works differently. Whereas short-term capital gains are taxed at ordinary income rates, long-term capital gains are taxed at either 15% or 20% of the profit, depending on your income level. And in many cases, these 15 or 20% rates are far lower than your ordinary income rate, especially if we're talking about an executive or someone in corporate America in this example who is likely making a pretty decent salary at this point in their career. If you are then going to avoid selling your RSUs for a short-term capital gain, it means that you have to hold them for at least a year before selling them. And what this typically leads to is having an employee who sees their shares vested based on the vesting schedule over a consistent period of time and regular intervals. And they have to kind of keep up with that schedule and figure out how long they've owned each set of shares. And when they are disposing of those shares, hopefully for a profit, they have to ensure that they've held them at least a year to lock in those long-term capital gains rates and not the short-term ordinary income rates. Let's go back to our employee who was granted 2,000 RSUs that vest quarterly over a 4-year period. And we already covered that that means that 125 shares are vesting each quarter. Now you can see on this table that even though 500 shares are vesting in the first year, 125 in quarter 1, 125 in quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4, the employee would have to wait until at least January 1st, 2024 at the earliest to be able to sell all 500 of these shares for a profit that would be treated as a long-term capital gain. Now, if you're looking at these dates, you can see that if they wanted to sell a portion of these shares, they could do so earlier than January 1st, 2024, but they can't sell all of them before that date and experience long-term capital gains because some of those shares would have been vested for less than a year. And to drive that point home, let's look at an example, and we'll assume that our seller in this scenario is in the 32% tax bracket for ordinary income and the 15% bracket for long-term capital gains. Using the same vesting schedule, you can see the dates on the far right in terms of the long-term gain date, and they have to wait that period of time before they can sell these blocks of shares and experience a long-term capital gain. But they do not do that for all of the shares. Instead, they sell 500 shares on July 15th, 2023 for $200 a share. Now, these were granted when they were worth $100 per share. So when they made this sale, they have $100 profit per share. Now, when they do this, 250 of these shares were treated as long-term capital gains. Why? Because they had been vested longer than a year. So when they sell it for this amount, it's $25,000 of profit, and it's taxed at long-term capital gains rate, which in their case is 15%. The other 250 shares are short-term capital gains. They have not been vested longer than a year. So this $25,000 is taxed at ordinary income rates of 32%. It's very rare that you get all of your RSUs granted and vested in a lump sum. Typically, they tease out this vesting schedule over at least 3 years, in many cases that I've seen with clients that we work with at larger companies. In many cases, 4 years. We've even seen 5 years in some cases. So keeping up with that vesting schedule is extremely important if you're considering selling any of them, because you have to know which shares have vested at which period in time. If it seems like there is no scenario where it would make sense for a person to sell their RSUs for a short-term capital gain, that's actually not accurate. So let's cover some examples of why they would intentionally sell it for a short-term capital gain. There are a ton of top companies like the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples of the world who use these RSUs as just a standard part of their compensation. If you're working in the corporate offices of these companies, you can almost expect that you're going to have RSUs as part of your pay. And in these cases, when employees go in for their annual reviews, it's not just a review of job performance. It is an expectation as well that you're going to discuss compensation and you're going to discuss equity. And they're going to give you the standard offer. Hey, we're going to increase your pay by 2%, and we're going to offer you 200 more RSUs when it comes to company stock. And it then becomes a negotiation. Some people may say, you know what? I need more cash in my hand now, so I would rather take more pay in exchange for lowering the number of RSUs that I've been granted. And for others, it's just the reverse. Hey, my salary is just fine. I don't need a 5% pay increase. I am betting on the long-term growth prospects of this company. So rather than having a 5% pay increase, could you give me a 2% pay increase, but instead grant me more shares of RSUs? So why is this conversation relevant when you're talking about selling an RSU? Now, why is this conversation relevant when you're talking about intentionally selling an RSU for a short-term capital gain? Well, I'll tell you, another common thread with these big companies that we're talking about is that they are often located in areas where the cost of living is sky high. The West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, these are not areas where you're going to be able to go and get a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,000 a month. It costs a lot to be located in the areas where they do business. And as much as we like to think that these companies are altruistic and that they do everything for the benefit of their customers and their employees, which maybe in some cases that's true, you also need to understand that companies don't want to give out more cash than is needed. So what these large organizations will do is, so they can keep employee salaries low, they will grant more RSUs with the expectation that because of that high cost of living, the executive or the employee may cash out some of those RSUs immediately immediately so that they can use the proceeds to cover their cost of living. It's basically a way of saying I could give you $300,000 or I could give you $200,000 and RSUs valued at $100,000. So now if you need $300,000 to live, you have to make the decision to cash out those shares, but I get to keep that $100,000 cash in the company's pockets. When you sell RSUs immediately, there's been no opportunity for them to grow, and you would just pay your ordinary income tax rate. So it is kind of like just having extra money on your paycheck if you get the RSU and you turn around and cash it out immediately. Now, if you're watching this, you're probably thinking this is a ridiculously cheap way for, in many cases, a multi-billion-dollar corporation to do business, but it's the game, and the game is filthy. So this is how things work. So much so that rather than increasing employees' salaries, organizations will at times just let their RSUs vest more frequently. So rather than having to wait 6 months or a year or even a quarter, they will say your RSUs vest every single month so you can cash them out and use them as a part of your pay. Let's look at an example of quarterly versus monthly vesting. Now, on the left, you can see that we have 4,800 RSUs that vest quarterly over a 4-year period. And we're going to assume that the current share price of these RSUs is $50 per share, which means that this is a $240,000 total value offer. Now, if 300 shares vest each quarter, that means that each quarter, the employee on the left is going to see $15,000 worth of RSUs vested. It will be treated to them as income, even if they don't sell the shares. Now, on the right, we're going to assume that this person is an employee that works at a big corporation and lives in an area that's a high cost of living. And because of that, the corporation wants to make sure that if their employees need to cash out those RSUs to cover their expenses, that they can do so on a more frequent basis. So in this example, they also have 4,800 RSUs, but they vest monthly over a 4-year period. It's the same current share price of $50 per share, $240,000 total value, but now instead of having to wait until the end of the quarter, they see 100 shares vested each month, which if they cash them out immediately would be the equivalent of them earning an extra $5,000 per month. Now, on the employee side, the one who's having to make the decision of whether they cash out those RSUs every single month is really towing a fine line between making sure you have enough to live and betting on the long-term prospects and the growth of the organization for which you work. If you think about it, if you cash out the RSU now, yes, you have the money now, but you have sacrificed the ability to experience the growth of that share price and cash out at a later date, which means that you could be sacrificing a potential wealth building event for you or your future generations. While private companies can definitely offer RSUs, I would say that a more likely form of compensation and equity-based compensation for a private company is going to be what we cover in part 2, and that's called stock options. A big reason for this has to do with how much of a risk it is or isn't to the company. RSUs are expensive for a company to offer. It is a will be yours benefit to the employee. When that share vests, it is the employee's share to do with what they please. It has immediate monetary value when they vest, and it's an expensive thing to offer on behalf of the company. Conversely, stock options have less risk to the organization, and it shifts that risk from the employer onto the employee, which is something that you see with these early stage companies very frequently. Now, the closer you get to that private company becoming public, you could then possibly see RSUs enter the equation if they are 6 months or a year from going public. But if it's a true early stage company, much more likely that you see a stock option as equity-based benefits as compared to the RSU. Now, when you do have a private company that offers RSUs, maybe because they're within that short period of time before they go public, these RSUs often have a feature that's called double trigger vesting. Double trigger vesting, also called accelerated vesting, is when you have these RSUs that are following a named vesting schedule in terms of the length of time before the shares vest, but they also have these events that could occur and accelerate that vesting. Those named events are called triggers, and double trigger vesting means that both of them have to occur in order for the vesting to be accelerated. The most common triggers or named events that you'll find in RSUs with double trigger vesting are 1, that company going public through an initial public offering, and 2, the employee being terminated as a result of that initial public offering. Now, if both of these triggers, these named events occur, then any remaining shares of that employee will immediately vest and they will be under their full control. But if only one of these triggers happens, there's not been a double trigger. There's only been a single trigger, and those RSUs will follow the original vesting schedule as laid out in their offering. Double trigger vesting was created really to protect an investor or a company that's trying to overtake an organization. Because if you are that investor and you're considering plugging money into a company, much less taking over that company, you do expect some continuity in terms of operations or even the key employees who work there after the transition. And if you only had one trigger for those RSUs, say the company going public or being acquired, there would be nothing to tie those employees to the company after the transition. If all that had to happen for my shares to vest was for the company to go public, and it does so, then I can leave immediately, and now that investor doesn't get that continuity that they expect. But if you put yourself in a position where there's a double trigger, where not only does the company have to go public or be acquired, but I also have to be fired as a result of that acquisition, well, now not only am I getting kind of a peace offering, a silver lining by being able to say, hey, yeah, you got fired, but your shares are vested. Anyone who kept their job is now tied to the organization because both triggers have not occurred, and they do not have the immediate vesting of their shares. It protects the employer who has now taken over that company or has gone public, and it doesn't protect me because I got fired as the employee, but it does put me in a position where I can at least go out the door with more equity than I had prior to the termination. Let's look at an example of two employees holding RSUs with double trigger vesting in a private company due to go public in the next 2 years. So this is company XYZ, and you can see that employee 1 has 1,000 RSUs that they were granted that vest over 4 years, and these shares have double trigger vesting. So if it's over a 4-year period, but the company goes public after 2 years, that means that at this point, only 500 shares have vested. Now, the company has gone public, so this is trigger 1 of the double triggers. And as a result of this transition, the employee was terminated, which is trigger 2. And as a result, you can see the remaining 500 shares they have are immediately vested. Conversely, employee 2 has those same shares, 1,000 RSUs vested over 4 years with double trigger vesting. And when the company goes public, it's trigger number 1 for them as well, but they keep their job, which means that even though one trigger has occurred, they have not met the double trigger needed to see the acceleration of vesting. Therefore, they must wait the remaining number of years for those shares to vest. All RSUs are not created equally, and there are a number of questions you need to be able to ask yourself so that you can assess the benefit to you as a part of your compensation package. RSUs are worth money immediately. If you cash them out immediately, you get cash for doing so. So it's not as if there's no benefit to an RSU with a company that doesn't grow, but you do need to understand that most people go to companies that offer RSUs because they do believe that the company has long-term growth prospects. And if you have any RSUs that you haven't sold, as the company grows, so does the value of your shares. So this is really important that you really ask yourself, do I think this company will grow? Is it on the upslope or is it on the downside of its prospects? Because if you're working with a company that has RSUs being offered, but its value continues to decline, it's not as beneficial as taking those RSUs from one that's on the upside of its trajectory. Even if you don't plan to stay at the company long enough for all the shares to vest, if you stay for a decent period of time and even half of them vest, this could be worth taking. If I have 3,000 shares that are granted to me and vest over a 4-year period, and I leave after 1,500 shares have vested, I still have 1,500 shares. That has a value to it. But if you're going to an organization and you know you only plan to be there for a year, and the amount of shares that have vested by that point in time are not as consequential, beneficial, then it's not as beneficial a part of your compensation package as taking a job at a company that might just offer you more pay for that 1 year that you plan to be there. Think about it this way. If you take a job at a company that offers you $200,000 worth of RSUs, but you only plan to be there long enough for $50,000 of those RSUs to vest, then $50,000 is the true value to you of that offer. You will find that if a private company offers RSUs and then never goes public, that they will at times submit an offer to buy back those shares from the employees. So it does not mean that you are at all times without recourse if you have RSUs in a private company that doesn't go public, but going public is obviously the goal of a private company offering this type of compensation. So you also want to consider this when evaluating the offer. Let's assume that the best case scenario happens and those $50,000 worth of RSUs that you were granted and have vested are one day worth $3 million. And that can happen. That's a good problem to have. It would likely mean that if I look at your portfolio, you now have an outsized position in one company as compared to the rest of your investments. If you have $3.5 million to your name, $500,000 of it is really well diversified in stocks and bonds and mutual funds, and $3 million of it is based on the backs and the prospects of one company, that can be a dangerous position to be in long term. It's a great position to be in the immediate future. I'm sure you would like this problem, but if you want to keep that money, as an advisor, I would typically come in and recommend that we have a plan of action for how much we're going to keep with the organization and how much we can sell and use the proceeds to diversify across a wider range of options, which would hopefully reduce the long-term risk relative to your investments. Now, it's up to you to determine just how risky you want to be and just how much you want to place on the long-term prospects of that company, but it's worth thinking about it now, even before it occurs. Some employees have a set plan of action where they keep a certain percentage in company stock each year. Maybe they keep 30% of their RSUs, 50% of their RSUs, and they sell off the rest and use it to diversify it amongst other investments. Now, I promise you, this is not a plug for me as a financial advisor or some CPA that I know as a tax preparer. It's simply the truth as I see it. So opinion is opinion and fact is fact. But what I will say is if you're in the waters where you are earning good money and you are now starting to be offered RSUs that have substantial value, you are the type of person that needs help. You need someone who can help you understand the tax implications of the RSUs when they are vested and also when they are sold. And you also, in my opinion, need a financial advisor to help give you a plan of action for if and when you're going to sell some of those shares and diversify it across your portfolio. So it doesn't have to be me, but reach out, find somebody that you trust, and form a plan of action for what you're going to do short term and long term with these shares. I hope you enjoyed this post and that it provided some clarity on our first form of equity compensation called restricted stock units, or RSUs for short. And I definitely hope you tune in for part 2 when we cover the first could be yours benefits, and that will be stock options. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do so and subscribe to the notifications so you know when new content is being posted, and we'll keep bringing that content to you as frequently as we can. See you soon.